everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 3. Our guest today is Pastor Elise Anderson, who is the pastor at St. John Lutheran Church in Abingdon, Virginia. This is exciting. Welcome back. Glad to have you back for part of this special discussion.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be back.
We're going to get into another wild discussion.
I know. I'm always ready. When I get the email. I'm like, oh man, let's go.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
We go.
I've been wanting to kind of talk about Judges for a while, but needed to work myself up to it, I think. And I was
totally.
We're going to do it.
We're doing it. We're doing it. Absolutely. So I love it.
We're in week 3 of our Judges study. And so we're going to skip ahead a few chapters. So I want to give just a brief recap of what we missed in the in-between, because we left off with Gideon. So Gideon has 71 sons. He had a lot of wives, concubines, and other women that he impregnated. And apparently was either rather lucky with his Y chromosome, or we just don't hear about daughters that he has because, they don't care about
why
women.
Would we?
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah. So one of his sons kills the rest of his brothers and tries becoming king. So this is why I say 71, because it says that he has 70 sons. And then when the story about the one son killing the rest, it says that guy kills 70 of his brothers. I was like, wait a minute. So
Hold on.
There's 70? Or there's
the math isn't mathing. The math isn't mathing. Bible math. Girl math, Bible math.
Anyways, the one son does this, kills all of his brothers. And God says, I'm going to kill you for doing that, and does. And that's the end of Samson's line. And then there were a couple of minor judges. Nothing really happens. And then a kind of a fun story, if we would have done more weeks, could have talked about the Israelites, once again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they were oppressed again. So we have Jephthah, the son of Gilead, and a prostitute. And God made him the deliverer, and they conquered the Amorites. This guy accidentally makes a vow to sacrifice his daughter to the Lord, his only child. And, unlike Abraham and Isaac, God doesn't seem to stop the sacrifice. So that's really sad. And then there are 3 more minor judges. Nothing happens there either. And then enters Samson. So Samson's birth story is reminiscent of Isaac, born to a barren woman that God willed them to have. He is a Nazirite, which means he is consecrated by the will of God, and has some kind of rules that go with it. Numbers chapter 6 talks about it, that he can't drink, he can't cut his hair, he can't touch corpses. These things actually are really important, like these vows that are a part of Samson's story. So remember those as we get into our conversation, folks.
Yep.
Anyways, Samson's an interesting character. And they're in a time now where the Philistines are really the force against Israel. They had control over much of the coastal plains that butt up to Judah. And Samson is taken with a Philistine woman and marries her. And then she betrays him to her people over a bet. He does honor the bet, but then goes in and kills 30 men anyways. And then the father of the wife ends up thinks Samson's not coming back or something, and ends up giving her to another man. And the father then tries to say, oh, well, here you can have her younger sister instead. Samson's not having it. And so what he decides to do in retaliation is he ties torches to a bunch of foxes, aka burning them alive, and uses, I think it's 300 foxes. It's a very specific number.
It is a very specific number.
He uses them to burn. So he ties the foxes together, ties torches to them, burns the foxes alive, and then sets them loose to go and burn down all of the Philistines' grain, vineyard, and olive groves, essentially cutting off all of their resources. And the Philistines were like, who the F did this? And so someone tells them what happened. And so then the Philistines go to this father-in-law and actually burned him and the wife alive.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting retaliation choice.
Quite.
And somehow Samson is mad at them for doing that now. And so Samson swears to take revenge, and so then he kills a bunch more Philistines. Now they're really mad at him, right? So he goes into hiding in Judah, and this is where our story picks up for today.
All right. Anyone who tells me the Old Testament is boring, false.
They haven't actually read it.
They haven't actually read it. Yeah. It's very interesting.
So today we're going to read Judges 15, verses 9 through 20, and I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We have come to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom, and they said to Samson, "Do you know that the Philistines rule over us? Why have you done this to us?" He replied, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." They said to him, "Why have we have come down to bind you, so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines?" Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." They said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came out shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed into him. And the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that had caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached down and took it, and with it killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." When he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone at the place that was called Ramath Lehi. By then, he was very thirsty. Of course, killing does that to you.
Yeah.
And he called on the Lord, saying, "You have granted this great victory by the hand of your servant. And now, am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split open the hollow place that is Lehi, and water came from it. When he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore, it was named En Hakore, which is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of Philistine 20 years. What a story.
The end.
The end. But it's
what a story. So not the end. My goodness.
Yeah. Let's we're going to talk more about the jawbone thing. But I just want to give you a little synopsis of then what happens to the end of Samson's story.
Yeah.
So then after that, he falls in love with Delilah, who's another Philistine woman, who spends a lot of time with him alone. She's trying to coax his secret out of what gives him such great strength. And she finally gets the secret out of him of being a Nazarite so that the Philistines can subdue him. And so they shave his head when he's asleep because the Lord has left him, and he begins to weaken. So part of the Nazarite rite, not being allowed to cut your hair and things like that. So that's where they said he got all of his power. So they shave his head so that his power leaves him. Then the Philistines seize him, gouge out his eyes. He's in prison, and while he's in prison, his hair starts to grow back. And when he was brought out to be entertainment at a feast in their temple in Gaza, he called upon the Lord one more time to give him strength, one last time. And he then brings down the whole place and kills himself and everyone in it. The text says, killing more than those he had killed during his life.
Which was a lot.
And that's Samson's story. Lots and lots of killing.
Lots of killing. Yeah. Tough story.
So Samson's an interesting character as sort of folks lift him up as this great savior of his people, this big deliverer, and is kind of called upon as this great hero, which I really struggle with that image of Samson because trying to figure out what he really delivered anyone from.
Yeah, and they kind of paint him as like this Herculean kind of figure. I
Yes.
mean, all the way down to like this myth and legend that he slaughtered a lion with his bare hands, right?
Right.
Like he's like the Middle East answer for Hercules. And yeah, so it is interesting. It's like he's not really lifted up like we see with a lot of other Old Testament leaders who were lifted up because of their connection to God and their leadership and their preaching. He really is just kind of lifted up because he was this Hulk of a man that smashed, right? He
I
just
can't even figure out
killed.
like why he was lifted up. Like, right? So we get this
Yeah.
idea that like his birth is foretold, that he's, got this consecrated promise of the Nazarite. And I guess I don't understand what God's intention with giving him this gift and this spirit was supposed to do.
Right. And like great strength was something that was placed on, or they claim was placed on all the Nazarite community. Like if you were a Nazarite in exchange for kind of this cooperation and not cutting your hair, not doing XYZ, you were given this like God gifted strength.
Mm-hmm.
It's like CrossFit, like the CrossFit of early Israel, and so it's kind of interesting that he's part of this group that is supposed to be lifted up, but he's really the only one kind of highlighted. But if you look into it, it's like there should have been others with this same strength.
Yeah.
So kind of what makes him so special that we still hear this story? Is it because he was just exceptionally violent and used his strength to kill?
He was exceptionally violent.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely exceptionally violent. I mean, and I remember like back in Sunday school going through the Old Testament and hearing the story of Samson and like kind of thinking he was super cool, right? Because it's like all the images are him like super muscled up and like wrestling a lion and pulling, big blocks and helping do this and helping do that. And it's amazing how much was really left out of those little Bible videos that they put into the church VCR for us to watch. But I have such a distinct memory of the section where he's like tied between two pillars after his hair has been cut and it's like just come back enough and he just pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls and these pillars come down and it's like, sweet revenge. He got back at them. But then revisiting the story as an adult, I'm just kind of like, wow, this is incredibly problematic.
Yeah. You bring up the Sunday school. So one of the an article by Beth Snyder, I can't remember where I got it from. I read a lot of things. I wrote down her quote because I really, really enjoyed it. She says, in Sunday school, I learned Samson had this supernatural strength given to him by God, and he beat up on the Philistines because they were against God. Hooray! Samson is a hero. But then an evil woman manipulated Samson into telling her the secret of his strength. And so now the people could defeat him. Bad woman. Then God gave Samson one last bout of strength to kill a bunch of his enemies in the temple. Yay, Samson. What a sacrificial follower of God. Yay!
Yay!
And she's like, but the real story, Samson is a wild man prone to outbursts of murderous anger, a womanizer, broke his Nazarite vows, traveled to forbidden cities, and took forbidden women. And his actions are mostly out of vanity and selfishness.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember this kind of demonization of Delilah.
Yeah.
That just didn't seem like a big deal back in the day, but now it's just and it's this demonization not just of this woman, but of this woman of the enemy, right? Like it would be interesting what kind of story it would have become if Delilah wasn't a Philistine woman. I mean, and he kept falling in love with these Philistine women, and then seemingly being punished for them. So it's almost like this warning story of, you can be the strongest dude around, but if you go and mess around, or if you go into this other community that we want nothing to do with, you will be punished. It's almost like he was just kind of used as a warning.
For me, when I think about like the violence in this, right? So this is like, we see that this, is kind of laid out as another God ordained killing kind of situation, right? The Spirit of
Mm-hmm.
the Lord came upon him, gave him
Yeah.
this strength to do these things. And so like, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, I was really thinking about this because I preached a couple weeks ago about um like what role in the world suffering has, and I think
Mm.
suffering and violence are really go hand in hand. Um but I think so often
Well, wait, hang on.
the
Let's distinguish that. Um, there is suffering in the world that is not like violent, and
yes
all violence does instigate
is
suffering.
yes. Yes, absolutely. But so I've been kind of thinking, a lot about kind of this idea of like God allowing or God ordaining these like negative things in our world. And, I think so often, especially in biblical stories, remembering the the human hearts, minds, and hands that wrote these down, and like their intentions for them. And I
Mm.
think stories like Samson were really used by the Israelite community to kind of create these heroes and these myths and legends to um, ignite like this unifying force that would make them kind of feel unbeatable in a lot of ways. And because at the time, I mean, they were very much homeless and scattered, and they were going against all these other, tribes and groups. And, we know like this area of the world has been fought over for millennia. And I think, when it came to the Philistines, who were, like you said, kind of the number one, negative counterforce to Israel and the Israelites at the time, they needed a hero, and they needed to feel as if God was on their side and they were the chosen ones. And so, I think all too often we can say, well, God wants this to happen, but really it's like we wanted it to happen,
Mm.
right? And so we kind of put God's will on our desires. And I think that that's really happened throughout history. I mean, we look at like, people in early America who justified slavery because they're slaves in the Bible,
Yeah.
right? And so we justify violence because it gets us what we want, and we feel like God is on our side. So God must have wanted us to take those actions to get what we needed and wanted. And I think, I know we're going to touch on the jawbone, but that to me was such a significant symbol in this story, because the Philistines, and this is one of the rabbit holes I went down kind of
Yeah.
studying this, the Philistines were known throughout the region for their advanced weaponry. They were like iron workers and were creating these really sophisticated weapons for the time. And so, but then here comes Samson, this Israelite hero that can destroy thousands of Philistines with advanced weaponry with nothing but a jawbone of a donkey,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like not only is is this an ordained thing from God, but God allows us to do it with minimal tools compared to our enemies, right? And so it's just kind of this, I don't know. I tend to just kind of say, we got to look at who's writing it, why they're writing
Yeah.
it. Like, not to call the Bible like propaganda, but it is stories told by humans that had an agenda. And I think that's a big part of it.
So the thing about the jawbone, right? So here's another thing with the jawbone. So part of Samson's vows, right, is that like he can't touch corpses. And so
Mm-hmm.
to get a fresh jawbone means he is touching a newly dead creature.
Yes,
That's a corpse.
it is.
And there's
It
some
is a
people that
corpse.
argue like, no, it only applies to human corpses. And I was like, he spends a lot of time around those too. So
Yeah. Right. Yeah, he created quite a few.
either way, I think we're
Mm-hmm.
touching on some vows here.
Exactly. We definitely are. I mean, you're going to tell me Samson didn't, indulge in alcohol after one of his, massive fights. It's kind of this very interesting. And yet it's a woman cutting his hair in secret, somebody doing something to him
So
that causes
rabbinic
that.
commentary actually says like so that he clearly is a man with a wandering eye, right? That he is often
Mm-hmm.
following his eyes and it's very lustful. And then that actually his eyes being gouged out is his punishment from God for being
Mm-hmm.
this lustful man.
Yeah. Which is something we saw in our gospel lesson last week. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If
Yeah.
your eyes cause you to stumble, gouge them out. That was very much, this is not really something I preached on, but that was very much like a nod towards, sexual acts that were deemed, whatever. It's like if these things are getting in your way, then cut them out. And so that's something that we've seen um, in biblical narratives
Mm-hmm.
for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, even Jesus was talking about gouging out eyes if they cause you to stumble. So it's kind of an interesting I don't know. Honestly, I'd kind of forgotten that part happened to
He got his
Samson,
eyes gouged.
that he had got his eyes gouged out. When you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's right. Another thing they leave out of Sunday school when
Mm-hmm.
you're in second grade. Yeah.
Yeah, I have
Weird.
a fun conversations with our like preschool teacher at the church a lot about like the different things that are taught because I was teaching something recently and was like, should I talk about this? And she was like, you definitely can't talk about that with little kids. And I was like, okay. Can I
Okay.
talk about this? And she's like, nope. And I was like, okay, I'm struggling to teach the Bible.
Yeah. I
If all
know.
of the topics are off limits, like how
Right.
do we do this with
I
kids,
know.
right?
I know. I go down, we have a preschool attached to our church, and I do a weekly chapel with them. And um, I basically just take my little Spark Bible down with me, and we started with creation, and we're just like working our way through it. And so, it'll be really interesting, as we kind of keep going, what I end up kind of touching on
Mm-hmm.
and what I don't. But like yesterday, we did Adam and Eve, and basically just turned it into a like we were called to care for the creatures of the world, and we were
Yeah.
called to take care of creation, and it's like there's nothing wrong with kind of taking that angle. But then I also wanted to like pull all the little girls aside at one point and be like, now you listen, you are just as good. You are just as good, kind of
Yeah.
go in with them and that. But yeah, they're like 3 and 4. So, they just wanted to sing the hippo song, and
Yeah, yeah. I was like, I don't.
so that's
I don't,
what we did.
this is not my area of expertise. And
Right.
I got to figure that out because I have a toddler, right? Like,
I was going to say, right? You're about to get some in-home training real quick.
No, that's why we bring her to church.
Yeah. let that pastor deal with it.
Yeah, let them
Exactly.
do it.
Yeah.
So there are like Christian schools of thought that people talk about Samson as sort of like relating him to Jesus in a way of like this great deliverer kind of thing, right? That like Samson's Jesus, and then the story with Delilah, like Delilah is kind of Satan who tempts Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that both of their births were foretold by angels and predicted they would be, sort of saviors of their people. Both are betrayed by someone close to them for pieces of silver. And I really struggle with this Christian perspective of comparing Samson to Jesus because I'm like, there's absolutely nothing alike about
Yeah.
these two characters.
I think too, I tell folks in my Bible study every week, which I kind of stole this from one of my seminary professors, but I've said, we have to be really careful of looking at the Old Testament with Jesus glasses on.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
Mm-hmm.
Jesus loved the prophecy of Isaiah, and because it really did mirror, like if you read Isaiah through a Jesus lens, yeah, Isaiah was talking about Jesus. That's what he was prophesying. But when we look at kind of these earliest stories through a Jesus lens, it would be really easy to kind of fall into those traps, so to speak, of this comparison. And I think if we were kind of momentarily going to stick in that line, right, of like Jesus and Samson having these similarities, we kind of see how necessary Jesus was because of the ways all of these other, quote, foretold saviors failed. And how the very human nature of their existence. I mean, with Samson, he's kind of the perfect example of like, a violent guy with, an anger problem.
I don't know how Samson's a deliverer of anyone from anything.
Right? I know, exactly. I mean, it's
every single thing, every single killing that he does is out of self-preservation or anger.
And leads to more violence, right? There's always this retaliation that we don't always hear about. I mean, granted, in Samson's story, the Philistines retaliate by killing 2 of their own, who, just happen to be tied to Samson. But that doesn't mean that there were also plenty of Israel.
But then he goes out and kills more Philistines anyways. I was like,
exactly. And
he was, even make sense.
And he was so problematic. His own people were like, you know what?
Yes, so to me, that's the piece of the story that really sticks out, right? That he goes into hiding and his own people give him up. So like what's their lens like? Is it sort of like,
right,
they're so afraid of the Philistines that like this is the easiest way not to get in trouble? Or they also like, dude, of course they're looking for you, right? Yeah. Like, don't get us involved with your petty murderous disputes, right? Like so are they, are they betraying him, or are they really just like self-preservation of turning over this murderer to a mob?
Right, exactly. I mean, and they're like, we're under their rule,
justice,
man.
Right? Like, is that actually justice?
Right. I mean, they're just like, we're under their rule. We're in their land.
Yeah. Like, what?
Like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you like picking a fight? Like literally, it's like the hand that feeds us. It's like these are the dudes in charge. I get it. We want this area, but like not this bad. Like not to the point where, I mean, in the whole like using foxes to set their crops on fire. I mean, that is some like diabolical.
Yeah.
I mean, to like, it says like, he set their tails on fire. So the foxes are just like they're freaked out. And I mean, it's like this like it's genius, but it's so diabolical at the same time. To use
that
them
is like a dark evil villain kind of move, right?
That's a really dark evil villain kind of thing to do, and then all it does is spark more violence. And you so nailed it when you're like, all of his motives are completely selfish. Like he never says, "I'm doing this for my people." It's always, "I'm doing this for me." And so
it is everything that he does. Like, right? There's no. It's not like we get this sense of like, they're in the middle of comparing with like, say, the story with Deborah and Barak and Yael, right? Like they're in the middle of like a war, right? In a battle, and sort of like they take this move to like take out the leader to kind of like, turn the tides of the battle. There's no battle happening.
Right.
He's mad because he lost one Philistine woman, and then he's mad because another one tricks him, and like, what? Okay, so like, what? I guess maybe this could be a question posed for our listeners, and maybe someone else could share with me a better insight. But like, how are his actions ordained by God?
Yeah.
I just this is one of the, like, there's a lot of parts of the Bible that are like problematic, right? Like very, very struggle. But this is one of them that like I really do struggle with. Like I want to like, someday, if I'm standing before God and they say a judgment or whatever, I'm gonna be like, God, I've got some questions. Right? Can we let me open up my Bible?
Yeah.
I'm gonna need you to tell me what happened here. Like,
right? What and God's gonna be like, yes, AJ, I've listened to the podcast. I've been keeping notes, and let's talk about it. We'll have your people call my people, and I'll be your next guest. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice, right? If I could just be like, listen, Judas, these are the things that we need answers to.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that's one of the big things about faith, right? And this is why
Mm-hmm.
so I did quote an atheist a couple weeks ago that kind of talks about is really big on talking about like there's no way you could read the whole Bible and still believe in this God because if you and he actually focuses on Judges. He's like if you read that book,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? Like how is this a God that you would follow? How does this like why?
Yeah. Well, it's similar to me when I hear even other Christians, modern day, say that they follow a God who is encouraging us to hate other people,
Yeah.
right? They follow God that condemns, LGBTQ folks. They follow a God that thinks, white people are the top dog. They follow a God who said, there's countless examples.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the God I follow,
Yeah.
right? And yet they're in this in our Bible, which we've ordained sacred scripture, and it is, there are stories of God saying things that I don't believe God really said. I think they're very much human interpretation. And so, but then it's like you get down this slippery slope of, well, then what's the point of all this?
Mm.
It's like, okay, if, we're taking the Bible and we're kind of cherry picking what feels good to us and kind of saying like, well, this isn't a human interpretation of what God says, then people can use that to criticize my preaching as well as anyone else's and
Yeah.
just, decide that it doesn't matter. Um, which I feel like I'm talking myself out of continuing to be a pastor right now, but like, it's
No, but
just
you're
kind
drawing
of
a
like
good point,
tricky.
right? And so that's just something I always tell people, like when we're talking about, like I'm a big don't cherry pick the Bible, right? Like that is how you come
Mm-hmm.
out with a lot of like crazy views when you only take the sides that you like and leave the sides that you don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Do the real Thomas Jefferson thing and literally cut the chunks out of the
Cut
Bible.
chunks
Like
out.
you
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
like,
Get rid of this Exodus thing. Who needs
yeah,
that?
yeah. So when we wrestle with it as like, okay, this is a part of scripture. This is a part of the Israelite story. This people of God that we see, the trace flowing throughout the entire Old Testament all the way into Jesus, right? Of this is
Mm-hmm.
the story of this people and their relationship with their God.
Yeah,
So that big question is then, so what does this story tell us about God?
right. And I think, in a lot of ways, it tells us, oh man, that's a big one. That's a huge question. And I think it tells us that, I kind of wrote down, God wishes for the success and flourishing of God's people. And different human leaders will interpret that in different ways and interpret the way to achieve that in different ways. And so I think when we know of God's goal, we don't always know of the best way to reach that goal until hindsight,
Hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
we just kind of decide, because God wants us to reach all of our goals through love and cooperation. That is pretty clear. I mean, Jesus said that enough.
Mm-hmm.
We can believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the hard way. So we as humans tend to not want to do things that are hard to do.
Yeah.
So for like the Samson story, it was a lot easier for him to be vindictive and violent than it was for him to settle these differences through a way that God would have actually wanted it to be done. But because the writers of history tend to only write their perspective, the perspective was violence was God's way because that's the way we went.
Mm.
And I think we're going to continue to see that even as we look back on our own history of whose way did we really go, our way or God's way. And I think that'll lead to some really interesting conversations about kind of the modern church and modern theological thinking because we're looking at the mistakes of the past, but we're still repeating them.
Yeah.
So,
When I think about like when I try to hone in on answering for myself the question of like what does this tell us about God? I really like get focused on this idea where, God God gives him something to drink
mm-hmm.
that like that's the thing that we can see as a direct action from God in this story, right? That um, despite what Samson's done, despite all of these things, God still cares for him.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
really know where the full end of that thought is, but this idea that like good, bad, whatever, like God's
Mm-hmm.
still caring for God's people.
Yeah. It brings to mind like, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do.
Mm,
And I think, I think forgiveness is such a huge part of God. I think forgiveness is such a huge part of God's relationship with us. I mean, so much so that like the Lutheran theology is like, that's the bedrock
yeah.
of Lutheran theology, is forgiveness for our sins and forgiveness for kind of our missteps and the ways in which we misinterpret our role in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that kind of old cliche of like, well, your heart was in the right place.
Yeah.
It's like, so, and I think in a lot of ways we see that here where, Samson gets the water from God, the rock opens up.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily see it as a reward. I think I see it more as like a mercy.
Yeah.
Um, and
Same.
then I think, that's God. I mean, God is mercy and forgiveness. Um, but still, it can still be tough
Yeah.
to wrap our heads around for sure.
I also always like to remind the listeners to remember when we're diving into these histories in the Old Testament, to remember that this is the story of a particular people in a particular place and time. That it is a story of, even smaller than that, a particular lineage of
Mm-hmm.
people,
Yeah.
right? That like, a lot of these people were their cousins and broke off into other tribes, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that these are the stories of these very specific lineage of people to explain how God has been with them through their story. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so that we need to take that into account, like when we read it, right? And again, I always like remind people like this isn't like we're like onlookers, looking in through this like thousands and thousands of year old window, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
know what was really happening. Like we don't know the stories of the others in here. We don't know all of the different perspectives. Like we don't even like fully understand their culture, their customs, all those things, right? And so like
Right.
if we don't take the time to even think about those, to try to put that in here,
Mm-hmm.
right, that all of that kind of shapes this bigger picture of what's happening.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot
Yeah.
of things that like we don't hear, right? And also to
Mm-hmm.
remember always that like history is written by the victor.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure if you were to
Exactly.
tell this exact same story from a different perspective, it's going to
Mm-hmm.
sound a lot different.
Yeah. I mean, how interesting would this story be from Delilah's perspective?
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
I
she
mean,
could have
she's
been
been in a
approached.
really rough place.
Yeah. I mean, she could have been approached by someone that said, we're going to pay you this amount to cut this guy's hair because he keeps wiping us out for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, like, she could have really just seen it from the perspective of, I'm not betraying this man, I'm saving my people.
Well, also in the
And,
perspective of like, does she really have a choice? Like, what is her
mm-hmm,
agency in all of this, right?
right.
Like,
Yeah.
like, is she being used, right? Does she even have a
Mm-hmm.
choice?
Right. Probably not from what we know of the time.
You get killed by these people, or you get killed by that guy. Like, what is the real
Right.
choices that she has here?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
Exactly.
I think you're right. Like, what is her perspective, right? Like, I'm not betraying him. I'm saving my people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, something I remind my Bible study crew every Tuesday is the Bibles we hold in our hand are the end result of a 4,000-year game of telephone.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, we can really take these words to heart, and we can respect them and appreciate them and honor them, but we also have to take them with a grain of salt and look at them with a critical lens and a contextual lens. And, you know, so it's just kind of something that's good to remind ourselves of pretty consistently as
and
we're
to put
breaking
them
these things
in
down.
the broader arc of the biblical narrative about, again, what does this tell us about God, and why, what does this influence us as what it means to be followers of God?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. How does it shape us? How does it direct us? And yeah, those are really important questions for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about this God-ordained violence thing about,
Okay.
I said, so putting in front of all of our guests sort of like these options of different ways that Christians have historically kind of either reconciled or theologically present some of this Old Testament violence that we see. So I just want to hear you take on them. There's 4 options. You
Okay.
also don't have to like any of the options, for the record.
Okay. Am I picking one, or am I just giving my
no.
opinion on each?
You're giving
Okay.
your opinion, and then like, if where it sits with you.
Where it sits with me. Okay, gotcha.
So the first option is that we can reject the depictions of God here as inconsistent with the God revealed in Jesus. That any violent descriptions of God are human projections onto God.
Okay. That's a much fancier way to say what I think I was trying to say earlier.
Yeah,
the only thing that kind of like I don't think is the rejection part, because that is someone's interpretation of God at some point in history. So we can't just reject it because it makes us feel icky.
Yeah.
But I do think that point of like the human projection is definitely where I sit with a lot of stuff. But I want to hear the other ones too.
Option number 2.
Okay.
We can reinterpret the descriptions of violence to make them less confronting. Like in the lines like "killed every living thing" is a literary hyperbole. And that while physical violence may be involved, it's not the goal, but rather that is the human byproduct of God's objective.
I don't like that one. I don't like that one. I don't that just feels like kind of sugarcoating it. And I think instead of sugarcoating it, we need to face it. That it was someone's reality at some point. And that, yeah. So no. Boo, option 2, I don't like
it. Okay. Option number 3.
Okay.
We can assert God's right to judge the world however God wants. That it is God's right to give life and take it away.
Whew. Ouch. That's a slippery slope. That one doesn't sound fun either.
God's God. God is all powerful. God can do whatever God wants.
I mean, like,
and that's kind of the to decide whether it's good, bad, or ugly.
That's the easy way out, right? I mean, that's just kind of like, you know what? This is God's circus, not my circus, not my monkeys.
Yeah.
I think there's certainly times when we can kind of throw our hands up, but I also think we use that as an excuse to justify our bad behavior, right? Like, well, I mean, yeah, I did a really crappy thing, but like, it must have been God's will. I mean, God is God, God wouldn't have let me get away with it if it didn't need to be happening. So I think like in a lot of ways, there's this freedom to kind of handing things over to God, like, let go and let God.
Yeah.
But I think in certain circumstances, it gets us off the hook. And I don't think we can, I don't think it's fair for us to be able to just do that. So yeah, option 3, I don't know. I don't really love that one either.
Are you ready? Option 4.
Okay. Oh God. Okay.
We can.
I'm sweating.
Yeah, you're fine. We can recontextualize the violence within the story, seeing the violence in the greater context of God's bigger plan. For example, Judges is supposed to be a horrific and dark sequel to Joshua in order that we may learn from it. That the Israelites, through their story, aren't given a blank check to kill whoever and whenever they want, but rather it's part of God's plan. We just can't see the whole grand design. That God is not non-violent, but rather anti-violent. It's God's nature to redeem, not destroy, but God will also defend against evil.
I I'm making thinking sounds because the listeners can't watch me think. I get that one. Like I do. I always, gosh, I try to be overly cautious about acting like we understand God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I don't love the idea that like any kind of negative or violent actions or circumstances can be part of God's plan, because I don't ever think it's part of God's plan for us to suffer. I think when we think about like the darkness, I don't even like using that word, but like when we think about the negative things in the world or what some people might deem like the devil or the evil one,
Yeah.
I think so much of that is like the work of the world that God is with us to combat. And so I just don't think it always works for us to claim that we understand God's plan even when we say it in like fancy ways. I just don't think violence or damage is part of God's plan. I think it's crap that happens, and God is kind of in partnership with us to move forward from it and face it. But saying that it's like God ordained, I don't know. I'm okay. So option one, I was kind of on board with it. Boo. Option two. Option three makes me feel icky, and option four just confuses me.
There you go.
So
that's a super a super good explanation of those. I enjoy it.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. These are. I just want to keep posing these to guests because I really like one, just like having the different perspectives and also understanding. I think that like I think sometimes people think that there's like, it's real black and white. There's one right answer and one wrong answer. And to understand like we all come in with different perspectives, right? And that there's room for that under this umbrella of people of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that God is probably laughing at all of us, right? Because like we just have no idea what we're talking about.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, yeah. I feel like God gets a lot of belly laughs out of us trying to figure all this out.
Oh, look, those humans are trying to figure that stuff out again.
They don't know a thing. Oh my goodness. I said, and then God's like, I've been waiting for the email to be invited onto these podcasts, and they just won't.
Totally.
They just won't send it. God's probably still on AOL or something, and we just don't know that.
I also feel like this is my working theory of God. Like when, like if you were to try to ask God answers, like just like a direct question, that I don't think that we would get direct answers, because I think that like God's answers to our question are so far out of what we could understand that like it won't, like it'll sound like a non-answer, even though God's like, no, I'm giving you the answer. You're asking the wrong questions.
Jesus did that for his entire ministry.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, the disciples were like, tell us what to do. And he was like, let's talk about camels and needles, actually. And it's like, wait, hold on. What?
Yeah.
But then the stuff that Jesus was really direct about, like love your neighbor as yourself, take care of the vulnerable, like blessed are the poor. We were like, no, that can't be. That's another camel thing.
Yeah, listen to it anyway. So like,
I know that. Like, Jesus,
what are we going to get direct answers
again?
When we listen to the other ones?
No. Oh man, that's just another one of your silly parables we're not supposed to understand, right? And Jesus is like, no, really, like I want you to take care of these people, and we're like, psh.
Yeah, what's the cryptic message here?
Silly Jesus. You and your stories. Oh, jeez. Yeah, no, we just don't want to do it because it's hard. So there you go. I don't know.
Yep.
But yeah, so it would be interesting. I'm looking forward to my moment with my face to face with the God. Just say like, all right, man.
Again, I'll have my notes prepared.
I know. Exactly. Gotta keep those records now. Be like, okay, I've got about 18 million questions for you. Do we have time? Okay, great. Eternity, awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I'm sure you have other things to do, but like this is
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Pastor Elise, for helping us dive in there. I think our discussion groups are going to have some good things to mull over today.
I hope so. Yeah,
So I appreciate that. Just a reminder to everyone, if you're kind of jumping in late to the series, of course, the previous episodes are still available. And if you go to our website, 10footballpodcast.com/judges, you can find the study guide materials there for all of the episodes. Additionally, just our normal questions for each episode are just in the episode information whatever platform you're listening to on. And then join us next week as we dive into another super fun and juicy story here. Remember, everyone, that you can always learn more about the 10 Football Podcast on our website, 10footballpodcast.com, and on Facebook and Instagram at 10 Football Podcast. And of course, wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, the 10 Football Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you.